It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
And welcome, listeners, to Hard Hats and High Vis, the election edition of the Two Jacks featuring Jack the Insider. That's me and Hong Kong Jack. G'day, Jack. How are you today?
Great, mate. How are you? Good?
Very well. I am free of COVID, and I hope that you are too. But
yeah, I'm absolutely COVID-free. I've got my magic traditional Chinese medicine in any event.
Well, I forgot about that. That's keeping you in good stead.
It
but you might have slung them across.
I haven't opened it yet.
well, you might have slung him across to Anthony Albanese last week because he's got COVID and he is out of the election campaign for a week. Is that going to be a good thing or a bad thing for Labor?
This is a bit like the concussion protocols in the AFL, isn't it? You know, you've got to do a week on the park.
He's got to do a week. He's been suspended for a week. So, good thing or bad? Does it allow Albanese to reset after a pretty shaky week one and maybe a little bit of a recovery from week two?
Yeah, they're probably going to be giving him some fresh media training or something while he's having the week off. But look, Labor's been going fine without him. Yesterday, I saw Jason Clare give a sort of a doorstop press conference. And I think I was told this bloke was a rising star back in about 2005 or 2006, and he was very, very good yesterday.
Yeah, look, he's very good on Friday too when the issue of the Chinese Solomon Security Pact was raised. The Labor deputy, Richard Marles, had an absolute shocker, but Clare came out and seemed to tidy it up fairly well. Marles continues to have a shocker, by the way, but Clare is going very, very well. He's a good style of bloke, and he speaks very, very well. And he has a great way of, if a question, particularly the questions were put to him about the Solomon's Chinese Pact, and he was able to just dismiss them and talk about something that he did want to talk about.
And he was following the playbook we set out last week. He was not talking about the things he shouldn't be talking about, but he was pushing the government on the key issue, which is that they have run out of puff, that they are a government who started to make mistakes because they've just run out of puff. And that's absolutely going to determine the election. And he was pushing hard on it. It was a really good performance.
Yes, he certainly you will think will be finding a lot more camera time over the next few weeks.
He will. Chris Barn, on the other hand, who I think has been a bit of a rising star as well, he didn't follow the playbook. He was talking about 80% renewables by 2030 and all that sort of stuff. And I'm thinking, this is just a losing issue for Labor again.
It's not even Labor policy.
No.
So what's he doing there? I mean, he's a smart bloke, Chris, as you say. Was Shadow Treasurer and did come up with all the reforms that ultimately got knocked off in 2019. So, look, I know he's a smart operator, but why is he getting into the weeds on that subject there when it's not even Labor policy?
And it's just not it was a losing issue for them in two elections in a row. He seems determined to make it a third.
Yeah, so, but look, beyond that, so with the absence of Albanese, and he did do a virtual speech,
and that was pretty good.
Yeah, it wasn't bad at all. So he's not, he's not in witness protection, but he's just not getting out and about. And on a somber day like today, we're recording on Anzac Day. He won't be doing those in-camera things, putting wreaths at the cenotaph and those sorts of bipartisan things that political leaders do during a campaign or outside of a campaign as well, of course. But it does put a focus on Labor's front bench, and so we've seen some good performances and others don't look so flash. Is that Albanese's always going to be a team player anyway, isn't he? He says he's going to be like Hawke and a consensus man and all that sort of stuff, which indicates he'll rely on the talent of his front bench. Um, early days, besides Claire, how have they looked?
Yeah, they're going okay, I think, but it'll be patchy. Some of them will be thrust into a spotlight they're not ready for, or don't have the talent for, and others will go okay. It's interesting they
Yeah.
have moved away from a few things. John Ruddock was a pretty fair pundit. He was talking about the ALP have stopped talking about the Catherine Deves issue in Warringah. About whether she's transphobic or whatever. He says that that's all come to a grinding halt, and he suspects that's because the ALP focus groups have told them this is a losing issue for you guys. Don't talk about it.
Well, yeah, we talked about this last week too, and that I would believe that it's not a great vote winner for either side. So once Morrison came out in support of Deves, the Warringah candidate, had these disclosures made about some of her remarks, which weren't all that pleasant on social media, that she'd scrubbed and was still discovered. Morrison, we talked about perhaps playing, his messaging was perhaps playing to Western Sydney into marginal seat like in the West like Reid. But he's also losing votes in Wentworth. He's also losing votes in Mackellar when he does these things. So it's best, I would think, for both of them not to get caught in the weeds on this.
Yeah, look, I sort of think you've got to let the independent seats fall where they may a little bit now. Nothing much he's going to say is going to make much difference there. So he's probably, my calculation would be he's probably right. Have a crack at winning some seats elsewhere.
Yeah, we'll get on to the independents in depth shortly.
Yep.
Did you see the leaders' debate?
I saw bits and pieces of it. It came on at an inconvenient hour here in Hong Kong.
What time was it? I think about 7:30 our time here. Yeah. So it may have been while you were enjoying Hong Kong's extended trading hours.
It could well have been during that time. So I saw a bit of it. Yeah.
Look, I don't think there was much to take away from it. I think both leaders performed reasonably well. But one thing that I thought that the questions put by those present, the so-called undecided voters, were actually really good questions for candidates, for leaders, political leaders. So, the sort of social concerns, like there was a woman who had a child with autism, which ran into the NDIS and some of the funding issues that have arisen there. There were small business people getting up and talking about what incentives, what encouragement, in fact, what discouragements would be gotten rid of that arose during the pandemic to allow them to allow these small business operators to get back to some sort of prosperity. And then I found that it was all just sort of dominated by the Sky News bloke. And that the punters weren't given enough questions. And then we moved on to a debate about the Solomons and Chinese pact. Now, they weren't questions from the floor. They were questions from the Sky News journalist.
Personally, I doubt the people asking the questions would care that much about the Solomons at the moment. Perhaps they should, but they don't. Foreign affairs has never really been a winning or losing issue.
That's the old axiom. The foreign affairs won't get you vote one. But maybe there's other things at work here. Is it a question of competence? Allowing I don't know what the government was expected to do, other than perhaps make higher level representations to the Solomons than they did. To stop this pact, this treaty, or pact with the Chinese government.
No, I don't. I personally, I don't think there's a hell of a lot they could have done much differently. But I agree, they don't come out looking very competent. But then nor does Labor.
No. Well, firstly we had the question about Morrison. Did you pick up the phone? Because an Australian PM should be. That's the first thing. Right, that's the first thing that should be done, and he did. I don't use a phone, mate. It was pretty poor. And then along came Richard Marles with with just a little bit of digging done by Sherry Markson at the Australian, most of it, that showed that males had referred to these sorts of arrangements between South Pacific nations and the PRC being not something that Australians really should be terribly concerned about, and that we basically need to compete against the Chinese for this kind of for advantage or for alliances in the South Pacific. And then it all turned out that he'd made a couple of speeches of that order while he was on a trip funded to China, trip funded by a Chinese or PRC think tank.
Worse than that, I think. She says that he showed the speech to the Chinese government before he made it.
Yes. What do you think of that? Get the red pen out. No, what I mean is get the red pen out, and we don't like this. We don't. Oh, sorry, sir. It doesn't look good at all.
No, it doesn't. So I don't really see that the Solomons issue being much of a determinant in the election. I think it's important. It's an important issue, but is it going to change the election? No, I don't think it does.
No, but I think it does come to a question of competence, and under both ordeals, both trials by ordeal, both the Coalition and Labor have looked pretty ordinary.
Yeah, they both lose on that one.
Yeah, before we get, and that drags us into our independence, but before we do that, we wanted to talk. I mean, basically, I made the mistake. Well, it wasn't a mistake, but I wondered if Morrison was going to go to WA. Well,
whether he was going to draw the Brisbane,
he turned up there.
Or whether he was going to draw the Brisbane line, but no, he decided he'd.
Well, in an act of impertinence, he turned up there the following day to sandbag Pearce and what's the other seat there, Jack? Sandbagging Pearce and not Curtin, because that's the one that is now in play.
Curtin's Julie Bishop's old seat, isn't it?
Yeah, Curtin is Julie Bishop's old seat. I'll just quickly go to it. Where Labor is Swan and Pearce is where Labor is favoured, fairly heavily favoured to win. So he was there last week sandbagging, and we said that he may not go to Western Australia, but there he was. Now, Jack, it would seem that there's another coalition seat in play, and as you say, that's Julie Bishop's old seat, currently the current sitting member is Celia Hammond, a Liberal, and that's the seat of Curtin. But it's not Labor that's on her case; it's one of the Climate 200 independents. And in fact, I've been instructed by the Climate 200 independents not to refer to them. I've been instructed by Jim Middleton from Climate 200 not to refer to them as Climate 200 independents.
Is Jim the party spokesman, is he?
Well, he is. He's the media guy now. He's quite a nice fellow, Jim, but he basically rang me up to say how this works is that these are independents who have risen independently in their own communities, and then they have sought Climate 200 financial backing, and once Climate 200 do their due diligence and find out that the person's fairly genuine, won't run off for the money, then they feature the imprimatur of Climate 200 along with a nice chunk of change to assist with their campaigns.
So Jim would be the party media spokesman if they had a party.
It's not a party, Jack.
No,
it's not a party.
Yeah.
It's an activist group that supports a number of candidates who have arisen independently.
Yeah, okay.
In their communities. So yes, I received a bit of a reproach from Jim about that. But excuse me, we are looking at some fairly major resetting of our electoral behaviour at the moment, I would think. I'm getting the sense that we will have as many as 9 and possibly 10 Climate 200 independents, I'll call them that. And that's with the 4 sitting who will be re-elected plus another 6. And that includes the possibility of Curtin going independent.
The gossip around the former advisor community with whom I still retain some contact, former political advisor community, and this is from people who've advised Liberal and Labor, you know, governments. The consensus seems to be where everyone thinks it's going to be a home parliament.
That's exactly what I'm hearing as well. We're also, I have some contact with the independent group, with the Climate 200 independents and people who are sort of advocating and helping out with campaigns there. They are thinking that they will succeed probably in an extra 6 seats. All of them, I think, from the coalition and Blue Ribbon, and unlikely to win them back in a hurry. So you get, with your two-party affiliated crossbenchers, that's presuming Katter wins, and Katter will win. He wouldn't win if Labor didn't preference him, but they do all the time, so he'll win again, and Adam Bandt will win Melbourne. With another 10, that's 12 on the crossbenchers, and that makes it very hard for a majority government.
I don't think we'll get that many, but we'll get enough to. I think it's the hung parliament is probably likely now.
Yeah. Okay. So, look, there's been a few people ruminating about this in the media. Peter Van Onselen wrote a piece saying if the coalition,
he's a professor at something, isn't he?
And he's a professor of Australian politics.
Oh dear.
So, well, just a little bit of hush while I read his important announcement here. If, however, the coalition doesn't win enough seats to govern in its own right, and neither does Labor, Morrison will be forced to go cap in hand to the crossbench pleading for their support, as will Abbott Albanese. I'll keep going. It's a fairly long piece, but he goes on to say, in this election campaign could be quickly followed by another one without Parliament even sitting. But that could backfire on the major parties, delivering more, not fewer, crossbench, good grammar by the way, not fewer crossbench MPs if voters are really sick and tired of the major parties. It sounds messy, PVO says, but it's not. It's called democracy. But that's not quite how a hung parliament works, is it?
No, I would have thought that a professor of Australian politics and a bloke who's a national political pundit would have had a better handle on how home parliaments actually work than that.
Well, tell me what happens. You tell me. Tell me what happens in the event of a hung parliament.
These have been going on for a long, long time, right back through the history of the Westminster system. But we have two recent examples, both in 2010 in Australia and in the UK. Both elections returned hung parliaments. And a hung parliament is when neither major political grouping gets to the magic number in Australia of 76, the majority in the House of Representatives.
Yes.
And in that situation, what actually happens is that depends on who can cobble together some numbers. Now, sometimes you can make a coalition, and that's what happened in the UK, that David Cameron from the Conservatives and Nick Clegg from the Liberal Democrats signed an agreement that they would form a coalition. So between them, they then had a majority. So Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, had to go to the Queen and resign and advise her to call on David Cameron and Nick Clegg to form a government.
That's the Westminster system in a nutshell.
That's exactly how it works.
But it's very easy when you are able to coalesce with a
Yes, that's because there was two parties, so that they were able to have an agreement between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrat Party. We're not going to be in that situation here because there's not going to be two parties you could weld together to form a coalition to make the majority. So in Australia in 2010, Julia Gillard was the Prime Minister, and she didn't have a majority and no one else had a majority. What she could have done was go to the Governor-General and say,
I can form a government.
This is the situation, but my advice to you is that I can form a government and that I am confident that I will have the confidence of the House and be able to secure supply. And the Governor-General would have said, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. And the Governor-General would have commissioned a new Gillard government.
Yes. And it didn't really need this sign on the dotted line type coalition of convenience with the Greens, would it?
No, because the advantage of the incumbency, the advantage of being the Prime Minister, is that you get first crack at forming a government.
Yeah.
If no one else has got a majority.
And in the event of a rejection of supply bills, but more likely
A no confidence motion.
a no confidence motion being put. Well, firstly, you can't do that every afternoon, can you, in the Parliament?
No, you can't. The Speaker just won't entertain a daily no confidence motion.
Yeah. And so it would have relied upon the Greens in the House to continue to provide that support to the as soon as that motion is it fails. If Gillard had failed in those numbers, then that is the end of that government.
But it has to be a no confidence motion. It can't just be a defeat on some other legislation.
Not in procedural matters, no.
Or even on substantial legislation. You could lose substantial legislation, but you don't lose the government unless it's a no confidence motion.
Yes, so I guess the point I'm trying to make in a rather long-winded way is that basically it would have relied upon the Greens to say we're going to continue to support this government because the alternative would be that the coalition is installed as a government, or that we go to the election and and we do it all over again. And that remains, as PVO mentioned in his article, that remains the case, doesn't it? That let's say, well, you've got two party affiliates. They'll go Katter will go with the coalition, and Bant will go with Labor. So that's split already. Then we got the four on the crossbenchers plus, well, let's say
half a dozen.
Another half a dozen. Let's say one of those might be in Fowler, by the way, a non-climate 200 independent who knocks off Christina Cannell, and that's on the cards. Now these other climate 200 independents, Jack, I'm reliably informed by climate 200 that they will deal with this individually, that they will make their own decisions, and that there is nothing that binds them together to act as a bloc or nominally a party on the crossbenchers, that they'll all make up their own minds depending on what's presented to them by the coalition or by Labor.
So the probability,
which seems to sort of defeat the whole purpose of this, of the Climate 200.
The probability is if we get a hung parliament, that Scott Morrison will remain Prime Minister, that he will be commissioned to form another government.
Yep.
Because Labor won't have a party to make a coalition agreement with in the same way that, say, David Cameron and Nick Clegg could. So Morrison will get first crack at it. He will be commissioned to form a government. He won't recommend to the Prime Minister, to the Governor-General, that we go back to an immediate election, because he'd get slaughtered if he does that.
Absolutely.
So the chances of Peter Van Onselen, I think, is incorrect in this. The chances of there being another election without a new government being formed are almost nil.
Yes, so he would muddle on with the support of, and he would only need, well, let's say he gets 70, he needs 6. He needs 6 from the crossbenchers. He's already got 1 in the case of Katter. He could rely perhaps on another independent plus another 4 to defeat. I mean, he'll be beaten in procedural matters routinely, but he may well be able to get across the line in terms of confidence.
Yes, that's exactly right. And no one's going to be in a rush to push the no confidence motion, because you can't do it all that often. And it's the old story. If you're going to attack the king, you must kill him. So Labor aren't going to push the no confidence motion unless they're pretty damn sure it's going to win. Yeah,
you're not going to do this every day. You need a trigger for this. You need something, some form of disgrace or scandal, some messiness,
some new disgrace or scandal.
Yeah. So there's plenty of old ones to go through, but it would need to be a fairly new matter, and then
Because people aren't going to want to go back out and vote again. They're not going to want the expense and inconvenience of another election campaign.
there needs to be a serious justification
exactly right.
for doing
Yes.
it, and
this is why we're doing this. This is why we're doing this.
Not least of all because that's your best chance, or that's would be Labor's best chance of getting the support of the majority of crossbenchers to get that motion up.
Yeah.
All right. So yes, Pete Van Oslen is right. It is messy. Well, it sounds messy. Well,
it's just messy in a different way that he thinks it's messy.
It's called democracy. Look, most governments in Europe are doing this on a daily basis, Jack.
That's exactly right. And there are plenty of examples in history of minority governments muddling on for quite some time.
I did hear from a sitting coalition MP who's facing a challenge from the Climate 200, from one of the Climate 200 independents. And he said, look, he asked me, he said, what do you think? Do you think, if we don't drop too many and the Climate 200 sort of campaign across the board is a bit repudiated and so forth, do you think that's the end of it? And I said, well, this seems to be a global trend in Western democracies, that majority governments are rarer than minority ones. We have to look beyond the United States, where Congress is messy, but messy in a sort of bipartisan way.
Well, it was designed to be messy in the United States.
Yeah, that's right, and it constantly is. But in Western democracies throughout Europe, minority governments are the standard, and I think, and I'd have to check this, but my belief is that Malta is the only country with a majority government in Europe. So I think we're headed down that path.
That's not many people. There are more Maltese in Melbourne than there are in Malta.
I wasn't going to say it's a very small island, but look, it's a fairly stunning statistic, that, and having said what, I have to check. It was the case 2 or 3 years ago, and I haven't seen Maltese election results since. But it does show that trend, and I think we're headed towards that trend now. And we're just going to have to be adult about it. Our politicians are going to have to be a bit adult about it and deal with it. Politics is if nothing else, the art of negotiation.
Part of the reason this is happening, and not just in Australia, around the world, is that the political spectrum's sort of been turned on its head a bit. It doesn't make as much sense as it used to, because the gap now really seems to be between, in COVID terms, between the laptop class and the people who bring you stuff.
Yes, and we saw that today. I mean, look, just breaking away from Australia just for a moment, although we have been talking about Macron won, votes I think are still being counted, but 58-42.
Which is a lot closer than last time.
It's definitely closer, but you would think it is still a significant 16-point margin, and that would probably be the end of Le Pen. But
a very low turnout and a lot of spoiled votes, a lot of discontent, I would say.
And so it may not be the ringing endorsement that Macron would like us to believe, and it does reflect this trend across democracies more generally, that we do have this growing divide, that what was once you would expect to be the left is now on the right, and they are sort of blue-collar, working-class stock who believe in a lot of right-wing or conservative tropes against the now more leftist and progressive wealthy classes.
Well, the progressive parties around the world have now become the party of the professional people and the well-off urban people, and the conservative parties around the world are tending to pick up votes from rural and working-class people. So that's been tipped on its head to some extent.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's just been completely flipped. The sort of truisms of politics post-World War II have sort of been flipped on their head.
Yep.
And we've seen it in the States. We've seen it with Brexit. We've seen it. We saw a bit of it today, albeit on the other side of the line with Macron's re-election, which is all of it's very predictable. But what we're seeing there is trends, and we're starting to see it in Australia now with people who live on the North Shore and the eastern suburbs of Sydney, some of the wealthiest people in the country, by average or median income and assets and whatever you like, are now trending towards more progressive politics. They call them tree independents. I think or tree Tories. I think that's right. So they're called tree Tories. I think in a sort of dismissive way, but that's changed quite dramatically. Meanwhile,
there is white as snow. These electorates. They're not very multicultural at all.
Well, on the other side, where there is sort of a lot of multiculturalism, you are seeing more conservative, social conservatism come to the fore. So it's going to make the major parties more unlikable or more unsupportable than is the case. I mean, than has been the case. So this trend away from the major parties is going to continue and probably accelerate.
Yeah, could well. It's going to be interesting, isn't it? But these are middle class areas or upper middle class areas with upper middle class concerns, but they're well off and they're white.
Well, they got homes for a start, Jack. They own their own homes. That's the big thing. I mean, that particularly out in the suburbs and even in the inner west and places like that in Sydney, young people are saying, "Well, I'll never be able to reach that great Australian dream of home ownership." That's one issue there, just alone, because the price of property here is becoming almost Hong Kongian, Jack.
It is, isn't it? It's a bit different to the 1970s and the 80s in Melbourne and Sydney, where you could just about buy your first house on a couple of credit cards.
Yeah.
And people did.
Now we get to the polls. There's not a lot of new polling around, and I presume News Poll and Reserve are being held over for Anzac Day and will be released tomorrow. We're recording Anzac Day, as I said before. Just a reminder, when we talk about this diminished support for the major parties, we've got Labor 36 in the News Poll and the Coalition 35. Well, that's 71 between them, and that points to a record low. If transferred to actual voting behaviour. But we have seen Essential, which does some very good issues-based polling. All of it's online, and I know people sort of raise an eyebrow whenever you talk about online polling, but it's at a very high level of sophistication, and it's pretty reliable. Essential has Albanese. They don't have a primary vote count or a 2PP vote count in their latest polling, but they have Albanese +2 in approval, and that was really taken not long after his horror week. Morrison down 2 to -2. That's just approval ratings. They're pretty much just the same level of approval and disapproval, just with a couple of points either way. But Morrison is preferred PM by 4 points. So, also of interest, Jack, in that same poll, the same Essential poll, is voting intention in terms of not which political party you follow, but how you're going to do it, what day. And 38% say they'll vote on the day, and is election day. A total of 45% say they'll either vote postal or pre-poll. I think it was 22 and 23 respectively. 12 are unsure, and 4% say, bugger you, they're not going to vote.
Yeah, well, they might be off the rolls.
Yeah, well, or maybe they'll take the fine. Maybe they'll get a little letter in the mail from the AEC saying, please explain. But yeah, that's sort of getting us up towards that 50%, aren't we, pre-polling?
Yeah, well, it'll almost certainly be 50% if it's 45 with 12 unsure.
Split the 12 unsures, yeah.
Yeah, you're going to get 50%. Well, I'm still old-fashioned about this. I'd rather people voted on the day, but, you can't stop progress, I suppose.
Well, one of the problems that does cause is that, you, particularly in a close election, this one's bound to be, is you're not going to get a result on the night because the postals won't be counted because there's a lag in terms of
Yep.
the final numbers, the final postals being received. Not all of them will be through on election day, and they do allow for some pre-poll counting, but only after the in-person votes are counted first. So the old traditional Don's parties, mate, where at least you find out who's won and lost, they might be a thing of the past too.
They might be. I also think it's a trust issue. People trust the voting and the counting on the day.
Yes, I think that's the only way you can get around it. You can't start counting postals because they're not complete. I mean, you can start counting them, I suppose, but you're not going to get a complete count of postal. So the only way to do this is to encourage them to count the pre-polls first, not the postals, but the pre-poll in-person votes first. But they don't do that. They're counting the ones that have been received. So yeah, we're almost certainly not going to get a result on election night. I'll tip that. I'll tip that for a certainty. While we talk about certainties, we have to move on to the betting markets where there's been no change, Jack. I mean, Labor had blown out from about $1, I think $1.30 initially, 3 or 4 weeks back, with the coalition at I think they're $3.50. Now $1.70 and $2.10. And there's virtually no change in the head-to-head or in that market or in the seat betting markets. I mean, I watch these things fairly closely. If anything, a slight shift to the coalition in terms of those coalition-held marginals, slight shift, but really nothing. Really nothing there. The money has come in for a hung parliament in from 260 to 225. That might be better than even money. That might be worth a lash. I think that it will come in even further as we go. And interestingly, the Libs remain tepid favourites against the Indies in those seats we think are at risk. Kooyong, Goldstein, Wentworth, McKellar, North Sydney, etc. Is that because Indies don't bet, Jack?
It could be. It could be that the markets are missing something, or I was talking before about people I'm in contact with who are pretty certain it's going to be a hung parliament. To be fair, a hell of a lot of them were wrong last time as well. So you never know.
Well, I think it was Sportsbet who paid out on a short and win on the Friday before election day. And I think they were, Labor were, crikey, about $1.14 and got smashed. So not the first time it's happened. I think whoever had a bet on Trump in 2016 would have done quite well, as would have been the case with Brexit, which I think was about 240 for a successful referendum.
I met a British bloke here in Hong Kong who told me before the Brexit thing that he was going to take the Brexit Trump double.
Oh, the double. Yeah, well, that would have played pretty well. I think there was a trifecta, isn't it? I can't remember what it was. It might have actually been.
And I said to him, well, that's going to be pretty juicy odds. What makes you think that everyone's gotten it wrong? And he says that's because in the UK and the US in particular, the media are concentrated in London, in the UK, and in the US on the two coasts and in Washington, D.C., and they neither like nor care about nor listen to the people who are going to decide these votes who are not in London and on the coasts and in Washington DC.
Yeah, look, that was one of the criticisms too. People didn't really understand the sort of shift towards Trump on that same basis. What we're seeing with these independents, these Climate 200 independents, Jack, is perhaps for the first time in a long time, the big cities are going to be deciding the outcomes of elections, or perhaps more than they have been in the past.
Well, look, there was a time when you and I were young fellas, the inner Melbourne seats in which we lived
Didn't budge.
didn't budge. You know, you could have you could have put up Attila the Hun and they would have won a Labor seat in those days.
Got very close to Attila on several occasions.
Yeah, there was some strange pre-selections, yes, but those days are gone. I mean, Melbourne's now a Green seat.
Yeah,
it was absolutely blue ribbon Labor,
and not budging. Yeah, not budging now. I mean, the old seat of Batman is held by Labor, but it's a struggle.
Back in the early '90s, Lindsay Tanner and Julia Gillard had a bit of a ding dong go for the pre-selection for the seat of Melbourne, because that was
glad that didn't pan out either way.
And Lindsay ended up winning it, but he's quite possibly going to be the last Labor member for Melbourne for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and Julia moved over to Gellibrand, where you can pretty much, you can rely on it at least for the foreseeable future. But, yeah. So we're seeing this, and look, if we flick over to the other side of politics, perhaps there is that sense too. We've been taken for granted for a long time. Probably the party machine there is less than a cricket team in terms of branches. Some of them quite elderly, let's say, and they might just be feeling, well, we live in this safe liberal territory. We actually want to have a say in things. I mean, that might be part of the driving force behind the independence.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. It's it'll all come out in the wash. That's democracy.
It is indeed. It's a mad scientist, Jack. It's a mad scientist, and it'll throw up some crazy stuff every now and then, and you just live with them and you move on.
But it always throws up the entertaining, and that's important.
Well, the Senate promises to be the usual freak show too. We haven't even talked about the Senate. We'll
get to that.
We will get to that because it's looking very, very odd. It was. It looks like P.T. Barnum had cast an eye across the Senate and go, "Oh, I could make some money out of these people."
Yeah. We haven't got quite enough crazies. Let's see if we can jam a few more onto those red seats.
I think we can. Yeah. I think it'll happen. Now, look, a regular segment here is the Peter Knott Memorial, when things go wrong on the campaign trail story, and this is week 3. And this is a story told by John Faulkner, the Labor stalwart senator, deputy leader of the party, among other things. And John told the story how he was with this wonderful character, the candidate for Gilmore, and was elected in the 1993 federal election, Peter Knott, who was a great eccentric in the Labor Party, and we talked about how he tried to organise a bit of a rah-rah for the media for the Labor Party based on its opposition to John Hewson's GST, and teed up a visit for Keating to attend a bakery in Bombala near Nowra, and when Keating turned up there, C1 and security and media everywhere, they walked into the bakers, and the belief that Peter Knott had teed up the baker to be saying the right things, the baker turned around and started getting into Keating about payroll tax and all sorts of other things. And from that moment, Peter Knott became known as the cunt from the pie shop, to Paul Keating, that is. On this occasion, we were in the heat of the campaign in 1993, and the government, the Keating government, had announced a small-ish fund had been given to save I can't remember the name of the frog, Jack, but we'll call it for the story the green tree frog. And they'd set aside a small amount of money. In those days, it would have been hundreds of thousands, perhaps, not the billions or millions that we talk about in these days, to save the green tree frog, which was indigenous to the south coast in places like Nowra, Kiama, and down the coast, further down to the Sapphire Coast along that way.
It's always very handy if you can find some endangered species in your electorate.
This is why this story is perfect. I don't know if it was endangered or not. It may not have been, but indeed there was being money spent to save this poor frog, and so there was a very small. There was an announcement to be made, but a very small gathering of local media were the only ones present to witness this. This clearly was not a major issue to drive the news cycle for the next 24 hours. So Faulkner was given the job of making the announcement in front of a half a dozen, perhaps, of local media, and Peter Knott was by his side as the local candidate, Labor local candidate, and Faulkner goes on to make the announcement. A certain amount of money was being spent and so forth, and he looked around to see if Peter Knott was still at his side, but no, he was gone. Peter Knott had wandered off, and Faulkner had to look back. And while the media's filming this, Peter Knott said, "I've got one," and threw his hand up to say that he'd found one of the endangered frogs. And as he said this, he shrieked in triumph. He staggered back and fell arse backwards into an open drain. And that was shot on film only probably to the Illawarra Mercury and one or two other local news things. Faulkner tells the story and almost cries when he does it. I think I've got one. Yeah. Anyway, look, so that's Peter Knott. And we've got some more. There's more Peter Knott stories. Enough to get us through the election campaign. Fantastic stuff. So, finally, Jack, Anzac Day.
Well, just while we're talking about the media,
yeah,
and we were talking the other week about poor old CNN Plus hitting the skids. Yeah. I think as we're recording this tonight in the UK, the wonderful Piers Morgan starts his new career with the Murdoch, the evil empire of Murdoch.
Well, it's not that evil, Jack. I work for them.
I know. I don't find them evil. I know you know. I think they're evil. They're all evil. Anyway,
they're all despised. I know that.
I couldn't think of a better start to a new media career because his first interview is with former President Donald Trump. And of course, Piers won Celebrity Apprentice or something, so he's an old buddy.
They were. Mates.
They were old buddies. They had a bit of a falling out.
Yeah, there was a bit of a falling out.
Piers decided to trash him anyway. So this is a big get for your first interview on a media program, but it gets better than that. Piers is leaking advanced footage which shows Trump getting the shits and walking out of the interview. And I thought, is there a better possible start? How many more eyeballs could you possibly get around the world than having Donald Trump and he walks out?
Storming out. Now, for what it's worth, Jack, you're right, this footage has been leaked in bits and bobs, and I have seen it, and certainly Donnie is not happy.
He says it's a setup, and he didn't walk out at all.
Yeah, he certainly gets to his feet. He gets to his feet, and he doesn't seem very happy. And he calls Piers Morgan a fool, and it does look like he's gone the full Clive Palmer, because Clive Palmer couldn't do an interview 3 or 4 years ago without walking out. You know, you just used to get used to the fact that he'd be all sounded up. So
I don't want to think about
cable running out of
taking his shirt off.
Yeah, you can set your clock by Clive Palmer walking out of an interview, but that is the big one. That is Donald Trump spitting the dummy And what better way to kick off your new job with Sky News? So the show will be broadcast from the UK to
Yeah,
Sky
not
News
everyone's
in
cup of
Australia.
tea, Piers, but he does have a certain genius for attracting eyeballs on the social media and
Oh,
on the television.
he's just a great niggler. He really just does. He's got that great mix of being annoying and watchable. And so yes, I
And a
expect that show
hide
to
as
go
a
really
hide
well.
as thick as a rhinoceros. He doesn't care what people say about him.
No, that's you can't do it unless you like that. If you start wondering, oh, perhaps people don't like me, then you're not going to survive in that sort of business.
No, you're not. So what's going to
No.
happen in Australia? This will be broadcast in Australia, I might add.
Yeah, it will be. Yes, I think
Yeah,
it's coming
yeah,
out this week.
What's going to happen in our election campaign for the next week?
Well, we're going to have virtually we're having a day off today with Anzac Day and
as we
the
should.
sort of somber commemorations of what Anzac Day is all about,
And a
then
bit of
it's back
footy.
into it. And I think we really are looking at the campaign intensifying. I think there'll be more and more of the sort of media attacks on the Climate 200 independents, because I think some of the media at last will be coming to the realisation that things are looking a bit ordinary for the coalition in some of those seats, and I expect the Labor. I expect the Labor team to be out and proud, and Jason Clare up the front.
Oh yeah. He's you got to play him at centre half forward.
Yeah, you play him at centre half forward. You might put Richard Marles, just give him some time on the pine for a little while. What do you reckon?
Yeah.
Send
We'll call on you when we need you, Richard.
Yeah, send him to Kiama for the Green Tree Frog announcement. Yeah. No, look, that sounds about right to me, Jack. Thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to presenting our shows as we go throughout the election campaign. Hard hats and high vis, we call it. And what we'd ask you to do, if you're listening to this and you've got some sort of social media profile, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might be, give us a mention. Drop us a link drop a link out there to your friends and get them to have a listen too. We could promote it, and I'm an excellent self-promoter, but it doesn't really work very well. So if you could, if you've enjoyed our takes on the election campaign, let your friends know through social media. And thanks very much for your time, Jack. We'll talk to you next week.
Or even if you just want to listen to a bit of sledging of Peter Van Onselen,
We did have a bit of a sledge. Look, It wasn't. He didn't get it right, did he? I mean, get it right.
Yeah.